Dr. Harold Weaver, we're in Paris. It's November 4th, 2013, and we're here to talk about your participation in FESMAN, which was the first World Festival of Negro Arts held in Dakar in 1966. So, in April of that year, you board a plane for Dakar to attend the festival. How old were you at the time?
Let's see, I must have been about 32 at that point.
And had you traveled to the African continent before then?
I had actually traveled to the African continent several times before '66. I brought a group of teachers and students on behalf of the Experiment in International Living to Nigeria. We spent the summer living with families in the various geographical regions, getting to know pretty well some of the elite, both economic, political, as well as educational and media. The next time I was in Africa was in 1964 for the Non-Aligned Conference of leaders in Cairo, and I was a stringer for UPI at that particular major conference. And then finally in 1965, a year before Dakar, I was part of an ABC, American Broadcasting Company, team of journalists to cover the Afro-Asian Summit. However, before the summit could occur, the president of Algeria, the host Ben Bella, was overthrown. And so the foreign ministers had already gathered, and so we had begun our work. But because of the overthrow of Ben Bella, the conference, the Afro-Asian Conference itself, was canceled. So those were the three occasions in which I had been on the African continent prior to Dakar '66.
And where at this point were you in your professional and your ideological and your spiritual itinerary?
Well, I was really at the beginning of my career as a teacher in African studies. That spring, I was an adjunct teaching African politics at Hunter College of the City University of New York. And then that fall, I was to take a position at Long Island University, Southampton College, which had the only required Third World course in the world. All students their junior year had to take a course on the Third World, and so I was able to teach in my field right away, which was fortunate. So Dakar really provided a transition. Those two positions.
And now, given the fact that you had been clearly quite interested in the non-aligned movement, that you were going to cover the Afro-Asian Conference, clearly, politically, you were quite engaged at this point already.
Yeah. Well, and I should say not only the background of the African visits, but other visits, other involvements. For example, in 1959, I was a member of the official USA-USSR exchange program as a member of a youth delegation going to the Soviet Union. 1961, I participated in a World Youth Forum in Moscow, which was sort of the forerunner of the Youth Festival in Helsinki. I did participate in the Youth Festival in Helsinki in 1966, actually being recruited by none other than a woman named Gloria Steinem, who was leading an anti-festival organization that was financed by the Central Intelligence Agency. We learned later. And then 63, 64, I actually spent time as a journalist in the Soviet Union when I was collecting materials for my dissertation on Soviet training and research programs for Africa. So yes, my experience in Africa was limited to 3 trips, but my involvement in the transnational cultural relations, person-to-person diplomacy was broader than just the African continent, but interrelated in many ways.
Now, when exactly and by whom were you approached to take part in the Dakar Festival?
Well, one of the organizations that I was involved with was the American Society of African Culture, AMSAC. I was groping since Nkrumah's visit to New York in March of '58, 1 year after Ghana's independence. I was really groping for my African roots, and I give Nkrumah credit for having helped me to develop that. So that one of the exciting things about being in New York in that particular time was the high level of consciousness about Africa. The United Nations was there, so you had a chance to interact with African delegates. I did some part-time work for the African American Institute, which we later found also had some CIA money coming in. We learned later. I was able to program young African leaders in the U.S. contribution to the Cold War of bringing over African leaders to try to young African leaders to try to expose them to the American way of life. And in doing that, I had a chance to meet exciting people, Papa Ibrahim Tal, the great artist from Senegal, and others. And what they remember most is that I introduced them to people like Malcolm X and Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph. So my involvement in the cultural area was very deep. Now, I don't know if I've actually answered that question of yours, so maybe you want to repeat it.
That was extremely interesting. I'm wondering by whom and in what context specifically you were approached.
Yes, okay. That was just background. Actually, as I began to say, I was involved with all the organizations possible who had an interest in Africa. I had an immersion through New York to African culture, and one of the most active was AMSAC, the American Society of African Culture. And as soon as it was announced that they were chartering a plane, I jumped on the bandwagon. So I was approached by no one. I did the approaching, and then when I learned the price, it was just too good to be true, because there was no way that one could travel to Africa, transportation, hotels, brand new hotel that Air France built, and for that kind of price. We didn't realize later where some of the money was coming from, but at that moment, it was a great experience, and I was so excited about the possibility of being in Dakar at this festival, at this World Festival, celebrating black art for the first time.
Now, how was the news of this festival received in the intellectual, the activist, the artistic circles that you were involved with at the time?
Well, I think very positively, and I can't think of questions that were raised at that moment. And I even recruited some of my friends to go along to celebrate black culture. There might have been opposition, but I was not exposed to this. What we did know at the time was obviously this was a major Cold War effort. Remember that one of the reasons many of us feel that the Kennedy family and foundation was involved in the airlift of African students from Kenya in the 1960s was to woo the black vote. So it was obviously a continued effort by the Democratic Party to woo black intellectuals and ordinary black people to identify, for their administration to be identified as being associated with blacks. Remember when the first appointment that John F. Kennedy made was to appoint a white American, G. Menon Williams, the governor of Michigan, as Assistant Secretary for African Affairs. That was the first appointment in the 1960s by Kennedy. And again, it was aimed at the black vote, even though it was a white person who received that appointment. But it was a highly publicized phenomenon. So it was not surprising that the Democrats in power wanted to be identified with African culture, African American interaction. I think, though, we also have to realize that many events of that era were aimed at points in the Cold War. I mean, I think we have to realize that. There were other objects that we associated also with African culture and the airlift. That is the flight that took us over. And that was an effort by the U.S. government also to play down the influence and impact of an ideology of Malcolm X. But that was very secondary, in my opinion, to the primary objective of the Cold War battle with the Soviet Union.
Can you talk a little bit more, nonetheless, about this goal, the secondary goal, of playing down the influence of Malcolm X?
Well, it's an interesting question because I think black nationalism, subsequently black power, was a concern, but I think it was also a concern in addition to the U.S. government infiltrating left-wing white movements around the world, the socialists in various countries and the Congress of Cultural Freedom, etc. I think there were also efforts to infiltrate the black nationalist movement. And in fact, we have some evidence of that later, that when a Marxist at the McGill University organized the African Studies Association, there was an effort of some nationalists, black nationalists, to sabotage the conference, which was done very successfully. And I'm convinced that it was CIA people, that is, instigated by CIA folks to do that, under the banner of black nationalism, So that the Soviet Union and socialism were much more of a threat than the black nationalist movement in the eyes of the U.S. government.
This brings us back, the involvement of the CIA, this brings us back, of course, to the funding behind AMSAC. Now, several questions around this. Clearly, AMSAC wasn't what it claimed to be.
What did it claim to be?
What exactly did it claim to be? Yeah. That's one question. Then, how exactly did this covert funding function? Could you speak to that?
So, as much as I know about it, I can. The American Society of African Culture was sprang from, of course, the Society of African Culture in Paris, founded by Senghor and Damas and Alioune Diop, which also established the magazine Présence Africaine, which still exists. A little bit of history. In '56, they had a very important meeting in Paris. It brought together black intellectuals from around the world, Frantz Fanon. The U.S. government tried to intercede to be sure that people like Paul Robeson and Du Bois, who were on the left, would not participate. Richard Wright, they did not want to participate. So AMSAC sent a delegation over of decent people, Horace Mann, John Davis, all of whom were later involved with AMSAC. John Davis was the president. He was one of the early pioneers desegregating northern universities by black professors who had been teaching historically black institutions in the South and in the North, like Lincoln University, where both Nkrumah and Ezekwe had attended. But this is where John Davis was recruited from. I think they had a deep interest in African culture, and they were all respected by Africans. But there was also the element of allowing themselves to be used in the Cold War. 56 conference that I mentioned in Paris, their attempts to make sure that Du Bois and Robeson and Richard Wright were not representing the U.S. So there was that negative aspect, but I think they did positive. I know when I came back from Soviet Union in '59, I was invited to give a lecture to that group, and I told them share with them my responses, my interpretation of that of my first time in the Soviet Union. So I think, and they were very much involved in the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa. Almost any event that involved African affairs, somehow they were involved. And to what extent this was CIA supported, I do not know. But the American Committee on Africa, the conference, American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa, which was held at the Harriman House, the Harriman Estate of upstate New York, was convened by Martin Luther King, Philip Randolph, Roy Wilkins, so the Dorothy Height, etc. The so-called Big Five or Big Six of the Civil Rights Movement was involved. Now, the bottom line of that, I'm really to this day not sure. I participated, I was invited to participate, and I remember being a part of a group on Angola, which was chaired by Sam Pierce. Now, Sam Pierce was a Rockefeller Republican, who was a judge, and who later became, in the Reagan administration, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Affairs, I think is what they called it at that moment. And I remember after the conference, his inviting me for lunch, knowing that I had a deep interest and some knowledge of Africa, and asked me if I would be willing to take a very dangerous mission to Africa. To this day, I have no idea because there was no follow-up. I indicated, let's explore it. So I'm still not sure, but the fact that he was leading the group on Angola leads me to believe there was obviously some Cold War, petroleum, or whatever political intrigue involved. I wish I to this day knew what it was all about, but he's no longer around, and I have no way of getting the information. The point I'm making is that AMSAC was involved in some very interesting kinds of and intriguing things, both positive and less positive.
Now, did you become aware of the fact that the AMSAC flight, at least, to Dakar had been funded by the CIA and that there was generally CIA funding for AMSAC? Did you discover this in the very well-known Ramparts report of 1967, or did you become aware of it before?
I was not aware of it before. Whether it was Ramparts or the New York Times or Mainstream or publication, I'm not quite sure which it was, but whenever it hit the fan, the public fan, is when I first became aware precisely of both the AMSAC financing and the Independent Research Service financing that Gloria Steinem was involved in recruiting people to the various World Youth Festivals. The first one in Vienna in '59, and then the one I participated in Helsinki in '62. And of course, we learned then about the CIA funding of a number of left-wing white European organizations, as well as Latin American organizations involved with youth. And I know that one part of the African American Institute, where I had done some work earlier in terms of programming State Department visitors, future leaders, that there was some financing there of a guy named Frank Farrow, who had close ties with a number of the Latin American organizations, non-African Latin American, that were alleged to be funded by the CIA. I mean, the CIA was very shrewd in this, very, very shrewd in making it appear non-governmental and not giving money to right-wing organizations, but to left-wing organizations that were anti-Soviet, anti-communist, so-called socialist organizations.
Now, what was your reaction, and what was the reaction more broadly, again in the intellectual, artistic, political circles that you were moving in, when this hit the fan?
Yeah. Well, what I remember was, I mean, we were disappointed, but not surprised. I don't remember a big uproar. I remember when I gave a lecture in Harlem, relations between Africans and African Americans, and talked about AMSAC and my disappointment. I know the AMSAC people who were in the audience were very disappointed. But I don't recall, frankly, and I have to go back and look at the media, look at the magazine and newspaper reports of those days, but I don't recall much of an uproar. And even now, when I talk with people who were very much involved with Africa and who might have gone, or who might have been involved with AMSAC, I don't sense much of an outrage, because people were able to do things that they would not otherwise been able to do if they had not been subsidized by the Central Intelligence Agency.
So
I think that I'm accurate in that perception, because when I bring it up to people these days, maybe they're embarrassed that they were involved, even though they don't admit to being involved. Maybe it's embarrassment. Maybe it's a feeling that they didn't do anything wrong. I know that in the case of our subsidized trip to AMSAC, to the festival in Dakar, none of us were asked to turn in reports. But I do know that when I went to Helsinki, all of us were asked to turn in reports of people we had contacts with, and I just simply refused to do so. That was the first inkling, after it was over, first inkling that I had that something was strange. Something was strange. And it obviously was a part of the intelligence. I don't know if the people I recruited them myself to go or told them about it and let them follow through, whether they turned in reports or not. But that was one of the prerequisites that I did not participate in.
Now, so your general feeling is that this funding by the CIA did not have a particularly deleterious effect on the civil rights movement, on the Black Power movement.
Well, I think that broad question, I mean, if we take a look at, let's say, Paul Robeson, the way he was destabilized by basically a totalitarian system, and you had the House Un-American Activities calling him to testify. You had the U.S. State Department taking his passport away between 50 and 58. And then you finally had the Supreme Court in 1958 saying that he could not have his passport taken away for political reasons. And this, of course, changed the whole ballgame. So that the impact that it would have had on the civil rights movement, was probably significant in the sense that a person like Thurgood Marshall, unfortunately, who later became a Supreme Court justice, who was given credit for winning the school desegregation battles, was apparently supplying information about people like W.B. Du Bois and others to the U.S. government. So I think it was really a totalitarian system operating, and it must have had some impact on the civil rights movement. For example, if we go back to Paul Robeson, we know that the U.S. government, it wasn't necessarily, I don't think we need to separate the State Department, the CIA from the U.S. government. We have to look at it as a whole. There was the State Department called a meeting, I don't remember all the details now, it's in the FBI papers on Robeson, to see what they could do to ensure that he have little impact on the thinking of Africans and African Americans. This was in the late 50s now. So what they did was to agree at this meeting that an article would be placed in the Crisis, the magazine of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, indicating that Robeson was a fine man, but naive and had been misled. So these are the kinds of subtle and not so subtle incidents that the U.S. government was subsidizing to impact on the international human rights movement. I think if we go back to Malcolm now, you ask about Malcolm, and the important thing that I didn't mention earlier is that if we look at the case of Du Bois, if we look at the case of Paul Robeson, if we look at the case of Malcolm X, if we look at the case of Stokely Carmichael, we find that whenever a black leader or spokesperson internationalized the black civil rights movement, which Malcolm and Du Bois called the human rights movement, so they could take it to the United Nations. Whenever that was internationalized, whenever they were destabilized in some way, destabilized in some way. Du Bois was jailed. Malcolm was assassinated. Robeson had his passport taken away. Martin Luther King was assassinated, associating the civil rights movement with Vietnam. So this was a major concern, and I think it related to the whole Cold War situation. So no, the U.S. government had a major impact on destabilizing the movement, whether it was the FBI calling King's wife and saying your husband is having a relationship with X, Y, and Z. It was a vicious period. And McCarthyism was not over. McCarthyism extends to this day from the 40s, in my opinion. There are different ways. And anyway, that's a partial answer to your question, and perhaps a broader way than a broader response than we had intended.
Oh, thank you very much. I couldn't agree more. Let's go back for a second to this AMSAC plane.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Where did it leave from?
From New York.
Now, prior to the plane leaving,
Mm-hmm.
had there been conversations, exchanges, phone calls between the people who were going to be going to Dakar?
That I cannot answer. I can only say that in my case, the only people with whom I had contact were the people whom I suggested should become a part of taking this inexpensive trip to Dakar.
And these were artists, writers?
Well, on my flight, there were many people whom I did not know personally, but had heard about. I mean, you had Harlem grassroots leaders like Queen Mother Moore on the flight, and a friend of mine from childhood from LA whom I had not seen in decades. So you had a really cross-section on the flight itself.
Mm-hmm.
On the flight, but that was just a small number of people on the flight itself of the total number of African Americans who went on the trip. I knew a few people on the flight. Once you got there, then you had people whom I used to see often in Harlem, Langston Hughes, for example. Duke Ellington's orchestra gave a fantastic concert on the American Ambassador's in the American Ambassador's front yard. Greaves and his crew who were shooting the film. Obviously, and the Alvin Ailey group. So you had different ways of transport that people took, but I don't think I have any other information about our flight because many of the people I did not know. And as I said, if there was communication, I don't recall the nature of material we got from AMSAC. It'd be interesting now to go back and look at some of that. Mm-hmm. But I frankly don't recall to what extent. There was certainly no official orientation.
Do you recall the atmosphere on the plane?
Oh, the atmosphere was one of joy. Oh, yes, it was a very celebratory people. Many of those folks had never been to Africa before, and many identified. Many would consider themselves, like Paul Robeson, as Africans in exile in the U.S. So that was I can't think of anyone on that flight who I knew at least, who was not just excited about the flight, about being there. Yes, excitement. joy.
And
Pleasure.
how was the AMSAC delegation received when it arrived at the airport in Dakar?
You know, I don't have memories of that. I do know that people in our flight were taken to this newly built Air France Meridian Hotel on the outskirts of Paris, of Dakar. Brand new, finished, precisely in time for this event. But in terms of any kind of official welcome, I just don't recall that. It may have been the case, but it's not a part of my exciting memories of Dakar.
And so everyone on the plane was a member of AMSAC?
Well, no, there was no such thing as membership.
Or associated with AMSAC?
Well, anybody can be a part of this. Example, a friend of mine whom I recruited to go, he had no interest in African affairs. I mean, he was a medical doctor, businessman in Chicago, but he and I had been roommates right after college. And so not everybody had an interest in Africa. That's why it was really a broad section of people, many of whom had not been to the continent before. So no, in my recollection, AMSAC was not a membership organization. I don't remember taking out any membership. I mean, if it was, I don't remember taking out any membership. There were 5 or 6 members of AMSAC as on the staff there, but no, I don't think so. No, not membership.
Now,
nor was there any kind of political screening or anything. It was really first come, first serve.
with about how many people on the plane?
Well, how many people fitted on planes in those days?
That's a good question. I was wondering that. I don't remember.
Certainly under 100, particularly. But it was, I said, a chartered flight, 66. We were barely into the jet age.
Yeah.
First time I ever went on a jet plane was in the Soviet Union. I think that was the first country where jets were commercialized first in '59. But I doubt if that was a jet plane. In fact, I'm almost certain it was not.
Was it associated with a particular company?
Yes, but I don't recall the name of the company. Overseas something or another. If I can remember written on the plane. But I suspect that even that company was subsidized by the CIA, was a CIA cover company, as I think back now, because I think that was one of the companies that was exposed in the media expose about the CIA involvement in a number of kinds of activities.
Do you recall your very first impression of Dakar?
I have so many impressions of Dakar over the years. One that I vividly recall was simply landing with the cool ocean breeze. Another early impression was the beauty and gracefulness of the women in their fantastically attractive costumes. I had little contact with slums. I had the people whom I met at the festival or re-met, like Langston Hughes. It was more, I think, people-oriented impressions that that I have, seeing folks from Paris, from Présence again. Those were exciting. And Leon Damas was the name I was trying to think of. Seeing him sitting, I can still see him sitting on the porch downtown Dakar. So those were some of the first images that I recall. Obviously, there were other exciting images later to be seen, including a fantastic Ethiopian theater group that performed there, and being introduced to African film for the first time with the premiere of La Noire, the film of first feature film by Ousmane Sembène. The music of the orchestra of Ellington. So these are many impressions I have. Precisely the first one, it's hard to accept the airport and the weather and the cool breeze and the feeling of the ocean and the desire at the time to say, this is where I will be retired.
You would go on after that, of course, to have one of the very first, if not the first major interview in 1972 of Sembène in the United States. Did you meet Sembène in Dakar?
I don't remember meeting Sembène in Dakar. As a matter of fact, I know I didn't. In fact, the first time I met Sembène was when I met him at the airport in New York when he arrived in 1970. I had never seen him before, and he was traveling with Carrie Moore, who later became Carrie Moore Sembène. She did her PhD dissertation on Sembène at Indiana University. So no, the first time was 70 when I met him at the airport, and then he was my guest at the African Studies Association meeting, because at that point I was chairing, it was called the Visual Resources Committee of the African Studies Association, and we were presenting film and trying to get Africanists to use film more. This would have been in Philadelphia in 1970, but I met him at what was then now the JFK airport. I forgot what it's called. What it was called then.
Yeah, I forget what it was called as well, but it was not JFK.
So no, I did not meet him at that particular screen. He was obviously there with his Sorrento Theater, and it was a very celebratory occasion. I had not begun to use film about Africa then. I began the following fall, so this was, I have no idea whether unconsciously or subconsciously or consciously this impacted on my later amour with African film, but it was certainly an important occasion for the Senegalese and for people at the festival.
And you were, of course, the first person ever to give a course on African film in the United States.
Apparently.
And I imagine that Sembène was a key figure.
And Guy Bell says I'm the first in the world, but I don't know whether that's true or not.
I suspect it is.
Yeah, but it was certainly the first in the U.S., so far as I know. I'm glad you are helping me to recall, because those events that I mentioned to you and others that I've not mentioned, I really need to get back and get up to snuff on and do some writing on in terms of my own experiences and reactions and interactions and what have you. So it's a joy
Thank
to have
you very
this.
much.
The timing is good because I'm trying to design how I'm going to work on the memoirs.